Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Williamsburg City Council meeting of Monday, December 5th. Mr. Trivett, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Ramsey.
Here.
Mayor Pons.
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent.
Here.
Mr. Maslin.
Here. Takes us to items for City Council meeting. Council preview, Mr. Trivett?
And we have a whole host of items planned for Thursday. We've got a long list of public hearings. Most of these are things that you've heard of before and a couple of new ones. The first one is a franchise agreement with Crown Castle to put up some poles in the right-of-way, only if the city agrees. And then we have the continued item regarding the conversion of hotels to affordable housing, and then two items dealing with Uptown Alley's application for a family entertainment center on Richmond Road. Under existing business or unfinished business, we have, I'm trying to go from memory because I can't get it to come up on my computer. 1 second. Perfect. Thank you. Consideration and appointment of the appointee to the Williamsburg-James City County School Board and the acceptance of the annual comprehensive financial report, which you're about to have a presentation on in just a few minutes. And then under new business, we have a budget amendment, recognize some grant funds, and the final item for the day will be a request from the Williamsburg Public Art Council to access funding reserved for them for public art in the capital improvement plan.
Excellent. Any questions for the city manager? Megan? Takes us now to public comment, which is again the opportunity for anybody in the audience to come forward and speak on any issues that they have on their mind. Seeing none, we will close that public comment and go back to item 4 on the agenda, which is background presentations and discussions. And first, we have a presentation discussion of the annual comprehensive financial report of the year end June 30th, 2022. Ms. Dameron, would you like to introduce our speaker?
Good afternoon. Today we have Aaron Hawkins here with us from Farmers Robertson and Cox. He's the managing auditor, and he's going to speak for a few minutes in regards to the audit. And then I have about just 4 quick slides on how we ended the year.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you for having me. Hope you all are doing well. I'm going to keep my presentation somewhat brief. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything like that to go over with you. I have passed out copies of the report to everyone on the council, and how I typically do these presentations is I may take you through a couple of pages that I think are the most relevant and then try to open it for any questions that you have for me. On the audit process itself, I thought it was a very efficient, effective process. You know, we do a week of preliminary work in the spring. We come back and do our final field work in the fall in September, and I think the staff all did a great job in being prepared for our arrival and met all of our requests and our demands that we have when we're doing the audit. And like I said, I thought it went well. To take you through the report, I always like to start on page 1, and you'll see there's these different tabs on the side. This is going to be actually in the financial section tab is where you'll see page 1. And I take you there because that's where you see our name at the top, Robinson Farmer Cox Associates. Everything else that's in this financial statement report is actually, this comes from the city and the financial statements and the accounting system here and all of the records that you have at the city. But this page is where you see our page, Robinson Farmer Cox at the top, and it's our auditor's report. And it contains our opinion on these financial statements that follow this. And even though it's 3 pages long, it may seem a little, is it 3 pages? Yeah, 3 pages long. What it really boils down to is that based on the testing that we've done, we feel that the financial statements that follow this opinion can be relied upon, that they're materially correct based on our testing. And it's an unmodified opinion, which means that in our business, it's the best that we can give as auditors. Next page I'm going to take you to is page 27. And I take you there because that's where you see the changes in your fund balance for the year. And I think on council, you're probably most maybe geared towards looking at what your general fund is and what your general fund balance is. And the general fund balance went from about $4.8 million to $20.75 million this year. And one thing that I actually meant to mention when I was going over the opinion was that there was actually one big accounting standard changes this year that had to be put into effect into the financial statements, and it was related to leases this year. And I thought the staff did a great detailed job in preparing for that. It was a major undertaking in taking what used to be not necessarily an afterthought, but leases that you had for various things like copiers, things that you would pay on a monthly basis that maybe over the course of a year may have only been, $12,000 for a year. Well, if you have a contract for 5 years, well, all of a sudden, this is a much bigger dollar amount that we have to try to put into our financial statements. So it was something that I thought the staff did a great job on, and I meant to touch on that when I was going over the opinion, so I apologize. And lastly, I'm going to take you back to the compliance section. And I may have told a little bit of a fib because we do see our name, Robinson Farmer Cox Associates, at the top of these pages in the back of your report. And the reason for that is that we have to issue a report that talks about the controls testing that we did at the city and compliance work that we had to do for state compliance. And in this report, we identified that we had no findings, nothing to report as internal control deficiencies. On page 140, that's where we have our report and opinion on your federal compliance with uniform guidance. Being that you're an entity that receives over $750,000 of federal assistance, you're required to have a single audit. And for you all, the dollar value was very indicative that you were going to be tested for the ARPA funding for the year. And that was our major program that we had to test for federal compliance, and we had no findings to report based on our testing for that program. Like I said, those were the main pages that I wanted to go over with you. I had a much more detailed talk with the Finance Committee where we went into great depths on, I think, a lot of things within the report. But I'm glad to answer any questions that you have for me this afternoon and beyond this afternoon as well.
Good, thank you, Aaron. Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to mention to council in the watching the meeting that the Finance Committee did meet and spent a couple hours with you a week or so ago to kind of go through the audit, and it was kind of the sense of the committee that the audit was in good order, and that the auditors had done a good job, but more importantly that the staff had really performed their duties well to make sure that the information that's in the report comes back with an unmodified finding. So thank you. Mayor, any?
Yeah, no questions. Just obviously, as you pointed out, through that whole federal fund process of receiving the ARPA funds, that although that guidance is not clear, obviously Ms. Dameron and her staff did an outstanding job of making sure that the city remained compliant in dealing with all of the ARPA funds that we received.
Yeah, a couple questions regarding the ARPA funds. Was the audit made easier with the regulations on ARPA, where we were actually, a lot of those funds we could actually justify based on replacement of lost revenue, which didn't really require a federal audit, right?
So it was, for you all, being that you were over $10 million, there was actually an additional step. You all, for a lot of places that were less than $10 million, they kind of got to be able to click the easy button, so to speak, on keeping the funds that they received. You all, being over $10 million, had to prove revenue loss to be able to keep the amounts in excess of $10 million. So we had to review the calculations that were done by the staff and, applying for that. And so that was more work. But
that justified the incoming, but you didn't have to audit the outgoing funds because of that, right? There were less strings.
Oh, we still have to audit how they were spent. Absolutely. Yeah, we still had to, and for you all, it was a lot of, I think it was salaries was the biggest, how it was applied for you all. And so we had to go through and see, all the details of expenditures and how they were applied.
But it would have been more difficult if we had to do this based on justifying projects.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I would say so, yeah.
Where does your audit boundary in relationship to, say, the redevelopment and housing authority? Where do you stop, and where does that audit start?
So there is a separate audit that happens for the housing authority, and I actually led the audit for the FY21, which their year end is September 30th. And so I led the audit for September 30th, 21. Prior to that, I was not involved with that audit. I was new to leading that audit for FY '21, and I plan to lead it for FY '22. That audit has not begun yet, but I'm involved in that audit.
So there's no overlap. You have a hard line? in terms
Well,
of where
it
those-
gets included in your financial statements as a component unit, as a
Oh, okay.
discretely presented component unit, just like your EDA is also.
Right.
It's a little bit tricky because there's different year ends, but we include it in here based on 9/30/21 rather than 9/30/22.
And we've seen previous recommendations about adding staff for, actually having different responsibilities and backup. Where do we, and maybe this is, Barbara, where do we stand in terms of responding to those previous recommendations?
Well, right now, we have lost, not lost, but we had one retirement and one move on. And so in regards to replacing those, I'm looking at interviewing next week. And anything else that we look in terms of adding would be addressed in the budget. So we'll make a recommendation at that point. We'll also look at how our revenue streams come in and other needs in the city and make that decision with part of our budget process for '24.
But we have authorized, this question, we have authorized positions for those that were previously recommended, right? For the audits, when they previously recommended?
Yes, we do. We have added additional staff, one of which is already working for us, and the other will be part of the interview process next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any questions. I just think a clean audit is validation of the hard work that our finance department does. And so thank you, Barbara, for all you do throughout the entire year.
And I echo that. Thanks, Aaron, for the quick report there and what I'm sure was a more lengthy one to our Finance Committee.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. If there's no other questions, we'll go back to Barbara. She said she's got 4 slides.
Yeah, I tried to condense it some. So let's see. Get this one. Okay. The first one is just an overview of the general fund. We ended the year with a total of $53.6 million in revenues. Of that, about 12.9 is ARPA funds flowing through. Our expenditures for the year totaled $47.7 million. Of that is $10.2 million in ARPA funds flowing out and $2.2 in transfers to the tourism fund. That increased our fund balance by $5.9 million. We began the year with 14.8. We ended with 20.7 million. We had about 200,000 in unspendables. Those are typically prepaid, so that's not available to be spent again. We ended with an unassigned fund balance of 20.5 million. That represents 50.4%. So I thought it was important to explain that we had an ARPA receivable, and that receivable was due to how we reported what we reported to the federal government that had flowed through FY22 for salaries and benefits, part of our money lost revenue. That exceeded what we actually received in the year by 3.7 million. However, we had already planned that and what we transferred to the CIP. So that 3.7 will be reversed out, is reversed out at the beginning of this year. So when we remove that from our fund balance, and everything, the total amount we receive ultimately ends up as transfers from our general fund to the CIP. We also, at the beginning of the year, did a school spending plan, and so that comes out once we get into this year. And we also had a couple $100,000 that we were requesting to transfer for the fire station. So once you consider all that, we really end up with a 16.1 million in fund balance, representing about 39.6%. So I thought that was important to understand as we move forward. The next slide. Okay. Right. moving forward. There we go. Maybe I didn't hit it hard enough. Would you just take a quick look at revenues? This shows our actual revenues compared to our final budget. And as you know, when we budgeted for the year, we were somewhat conservative in terms of how fast we would recover funds. And fortunately, we did better than budget. I took the larger variances there. I know that under my other seems rather large, but all those are a combination of things that were under $50,000 there. Altogether, our revenues came in $3,290,000 more than budgeted. You can see that our hotels, meals, and B-Pole recovered very nicely. I have tried to refrain from giving you variances to the budget and also comparing to 19, which was our last year that we had before COVID, but I can't help myself. I have to do it for hotels and meals. We finished the year in hotels about $200,000 more than we did in fiscal 19, and meals was $600,000 more. Now, as we move to the budget, we may try to apply some inflation there, because I'm sure that there's some impact there, but I have not done that for this. We'll maybe look at that at the budget retreat. But other things that came in substantially higher were recordation taxes. We also saw an adjustment in our enterprise overhead, more than was budgeted, and that's just to recover some of the costs that we share, that the utility fund uses services. Our EMS recovery, if you'll recall, during COVID, we saw a drop in that because people were a little bit hesitant to want to call for that service, and we're seeing that pick up very well too, as well as our permits. Those are predominantly, that increase comes from the building permits. We also saw our current real estate come in higher than what we budgeted. That was some supplemental building. The rent for the community building came in higher, and of course there for a while we saw a drop off in some of our rentals for that type thing that began to pick up. Delinquent real estate picked up. We also have a couple of negatives there. We're used to that communication tax. It seems like every year that gets smaller and smaller. The Prince George parking garage was under what we had budgeted. And the current personal property also came under budget. Just to mention some of what's driving that is a new software was implemented, and they were not able to get their delinquent billing out as timely. It also impacted our DMV stops that we do when their tax bill isn't paid. So I foresee that that's a temporary situation. The software, everybody's been trained on it now, and we're able to print those delinquent bills and get them out in a timely fashion. Looking at our expenditures. Okay, is it me or the button? Okay, wrong one? Okay. Yeah, okay. I think I figured it out though, thank you. It's a new one. If you hit the right button, it helps. Looking at our expenditures, of course, the first one was education. We already reviewed back in September that they came in under budget by about $583,000. A large part of that had to do with their sales tax from the state coming in better than budget. Public assistance, we transferred what was needed to be transferred. At the time we had to make those decisions, we didn't have all our entries in. We were kind of concerned about where we might land. Typically, for the last several years, we've been transferring what we budgeted, and that's because we like for the Public Assistance Fund to have a fund balance. That helps us cover things like the Child Service Act that addresses needs of children at risk, and it's helpful that if they have a large expenditure come in, that they have a fund balance to draw from, as opposed to having to transfer more than budgeted from the general fund. Public safety, parks and rec, community development, as well as the general government administration all came in under budget, and predominantly most of that was driven from vacancies, salary savings, benefits, that type thing. I think Parks and Rec also had some savings in professional services for some events that are, or services that they did not need, I think primarily due to some of the vacancies. Also, Public Works also had some vacancies, but they also saw their recyclable charges come in lower than budgeted. So that pretty much gives you a high-level look. We came in under 2.2 million under expenditures. You'll see at the bottom we have a negative there. It's just 39,000, but that was part of that lease gas fee that we had to make. And what that really is are the copiers that at one time were considered rent. Now they're principal and interest payments, and of course we didn't budget for that last year, so that's why that's showing up as a variance from the budget. I did want to speak to the utility fund just a little bit. You see we did very well there. The one negative we have, negative variance that we have in revenues is because we didn't need to transfer from the reserve, so it's actually a good thing. The water service revenue came in about 400,000 more, as well as the service, sewer service. We also saw an additional 800,000 over budget in what's deemed other revenue, and predominantly that was for water connections and availability charges, as well as sewer tap fees. So generally that indicates new development. In their expenditures, the only one that we have a negative variance in is the sewer, and that is related to sending more payments to the Hampton Roads Sanitation District, is an impact of that revenue coming in higher too. So we did have an increase in our net position in the utility fund of $800,000. And then in our tourism fund, you can see there that we did much better with our $2 lodging than budgeted. We also did better with our 1% sales tax. In terms of expenditures, we had positive variances everywhere except the tourism marketing. And that negative variance, that tourism marketing, what's really driving that is we get to keep half of the $2 lodging tax. The other half we remit to the state, and they in turn send it to the Tourism Alliance. And since that 105,000 negative variance is exactly half of the increase that we see in the $2 lodging tax. And of course, the grant awards, I think we had maybe one, so we had a large amount of variance there last year. And then we see a net change, an increase of almost $1 million there. The funds carried forward, that represents some of the grants that have been awarded and unexpended as of the end of the year, so we carry that forward. And that leaves almost $1.9 million remaining that can be used for future grants or at council's discretion should they decide they would like to do something else with that. And that ends my formal review and comments. I'll be glad to entertain any questions or if you have any comments.
Thank you, Ms. Dameron. Some good information in there. I'm glad to see that some of the revenues are coming in better than normal. I guess with the parking, I did have a question. I know that mid-year we had made an adjustment to some free parking, but I think what we predicted in what we would lose because we offered extended free parking wasn't quite 180,000. And I know in our departmental operating reports, it does give us the number of daily users in the garage. Do we see a decline in that? I'm sorry, I hadn't looked at it.
I don't know that we see so much of a decline as much as just maybe some issues with that whole process, some billing issues, that type thing, for the parkers that aren't logged online.
Right.
So I think we're smoothing some of that out. We should see that improve as time goes on.
Thank you. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I agree with the mayor. It's always good to see positive news and to see some of those numbers coming back in, as you say, comparing back to 2019. But one thing I think, and I know there's gaps when it happens, and this may be a question for Mr. Trivett, but when you talk about departments underspending their budgets due to vacancies, are we continuing to see a high turnover rate, or is it remaining about the same, or?
Yeah, our turnover rate is hovering around 20 to 22%, which is pretty consistent with what we're seeing in local governments across the country, with the exception of some that have extreme vacancies right now. I think the city of Norfolk is still over 40% for their total number of positions. So we're not seeing anything that extreme, but we are experiencing a lot of vacancies that are difficult to fill.
Yeah, and again, it's obviously seeing the revenue from those helps with the budget, but it doesn't help with the services and the demand on the staff that's left there with those vacancies.
Yeah, following up on that question with the city manager. So, given all that, are we seeing a big impact in terms of overtime on staff having to cover the vacancies?
Overtime is definitely up, particularly in the emergency services department, as they are requiring people to work shifts that normally would be covered by a counterpart in a filled position. But we're working as quickly as we can to fill those positions. It really boils down to, I think the biggest hurdle is, in general government positions, the applicant pool is smaller, and even when we get to the point of doing the interviews, so many people decide not to come or stop returning our calls that you end up interviewing one or two people, and ultimately they aren't the right people for the job, and so you have to do it again. I mean, we have that experience now in the planning department. We've advertised that position twice, interviewed twice, and still don't have a successful candidate, I don't think. And then in the public safety sector, we have a similar problem, only it's magnified because of the credentials required to do the job. So we might get, in the case of the police department, I'll tell your story, Chief, if you don't mind. We had over 60 applications, and only 8 or so showed up to be interviewed or returned phone calls to be interviewed. And a couple of them actually couldn't even remember that they had applied for the position. And I think you got a lot going on there. Number one is I think it's public service is still difficult, and obviously the pay is not always that great compared to what you could get in the private sector. Also, I think it's the fact that public service requires a lot of employees these days, and it's difficult to find the right person who's willing to take that on.
Thank you. So on a question on the revenue, can you pull up that first slide again? But one after that, we show the hotel line is the first line item. There we go.
Right.
So with the hotel revenue, actually exceeding more than 50% of budget, which is good. But as I recall, when we were putting the budget together for this year, we were very conservative in terms of forecasting that number for hotel revenue. Is my memory correct, and does that give an opportunity maybe at mid-year to adjust that?
Well, your memory is somewhat correct. I think we went back up to the 2019 levels, but not beyond that. But I think that as always, midterm, once we get through February numbers, and keep in mind, it takes a little while for sales tax to come in because we got a 2-month lag. But we're always looking at that not only to see, are the revenues coming in as strong as we predicted, but are they coming in more. And oftentimes, if they're coming in better, we may report on that. We may not appropriate them unless we actually need to appropriate them to expend them.
And I think what we saw most of the year in hotel revenue was the reason it was up was because prices were up, not necessarily
Right,
occupancy,
that's
which
correct.
suggested that there's still some capacity there. that
Well, when you
would
look
help.
at the $2 lodging, even though we're up, it's still not up to levels we would
Right.
have anticipated.
So
and
there's room for
yes,
growth there once,
right.
once the occupancy gets back.
Correct, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any specific questions other than what's already been asked and commented on.
Thanks, Director Dameron. I really appreciate this report. Something did just kind of pop into my head, which I'd noted on a second ago. It may be a question for you, Mr. Hawkins, but on ARPA, we've talked about audit of the general financials. I was just curious, after a couple of years of learning about it and the large expenditure the city was given, how are we audited on what is used or not used for ARPA funding?
I think that might be.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you. Should have asked before.
That's absolutely what we did. And so what we did first is we identify what was spent in the ARPA funding, because you've gotten X amount of dollars, but you've only spent, I shouldn't say a portion, but a majority of it, not all of it. So once we figure out what you've spent, that's when we need to figure out, okay, what is underneath this total figure. And so we get the details of the expenditures. We figure out what was salary versus if there was any accounts payable disbursements, which I think you all may have been entirely salary. So we got a detail of all the employees that received money that was allocated to ARPA. So we got a detail by individuals. We verified, what the pay rates were for those individuals, that they were paid those amounts, and that what they did qualified to be included under the ARPA program.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. One of the interesting parts about the program is it a self-audit, external audit, so it's helpful there are a few eyes on it. But other than that, no questions, Director Dameron. Thanks for the report.
Thank you. All right, so no other questions or concerns? Thank you. Appreciate the audit. And Aaron, I guess we'll see when we do the Housing Authority.
I'm going to exit stage left. Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Everyone enjoy their holidays. Thank you.
Have a good holiday.
Thank you.
Takes us now to item B on the agenda is a presentation and discussion regarding PCR number 22-015, the conversion of additional hotel and motel into affordable housing.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, Mayor Pons and all members of City Council. I don't plan to be before you long. I just wanted to go over two specific criteria that has been a point of discussion for this particular amendment. I put here the historical context, but I think all of us know where we were and how we got here, so I won't go through that. I did want to bring out a few things. At your October 13th public hearing, you tabled the public hearing and asked us to look at 5 specific items, and these are the items here in the middle: the loss of commercial properties, increased school population, adjacent property acceptance, lowering the median income, community acceptance, and also the impact to human services, fire and EMS, and police services. We answered those questions and we got a nod from you to move forward with the amendment. This just gives you, again, a list of the hotels in the city, and then the 13 that we were thinking had potential for conversion. And then most importantly, where we are now, the number of units. Right now, the ordinance allows 150 units in the city, and we're proposing to expand by 250 units post-conversion, and this would be a total of 400 units. If you remember, the Housing Work Group actually suggested around 840 units, so we would just be about half of what they suggested at that point. And then the other question that we had was the mix of the bedroom units. The ordinance currently allows efficiency 1 bedrooms and 2 or more bedrooms. And there are 2 different scenarios here. One, you can require 10% of the apartment units to be 2 bedroom, and then the remaining units be a mix of studio and 1 bedroom, or to allow 75% of the units to be studio and the remaining a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units. So just wanted to get your feedback on this today. I think the other parts of the amendment, everyone agreed upon, but these were the 2 issues that we wanted to have more discussion about.
Oh, good, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the extra time, or giving us the extra time to come back with some additional information and kind of tweaking the numbers based on the conversation that council members have had with you and we as a result have had with the community. And I think for me, where we've landed here, allowing the additional 250 units after conversion, so meaning up to 250 apartments, is acceptable. And then I think for in terms of the mix, I'm leaning, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on council some further discussion if they disagree. But I'm leaning towards the 75% of the units being studio, and then allowing the developer to come back with a proposal which would allow for studio plus, 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, whatever that number may look like. And I think then that gives the city, planning commission, city council the opportunity to weigh in on that mix at the time. So that's kind of where I'm leaning, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, and I agree. I like the, obviously I agree with the increase to 250 units, and I do also like the 75% of the units to be studio and a remaining mix of the other units. One thing I did discuss with Mr. Trivett, I don't know if he had the opportunity to discuss with you, was the affordability. And I told him, I don't know if I read it so many times I confused myself, but I really wanted to understand how we ensured that these units were affordable as it's stated in the ordinance.
He did talk to me about that. How we define affordability is that 80%, and that 80% of the area median income is considered low income by HUD standards. So if you took a household that had one person, $52,400 is what's considered low income for a one-person household. If we did 30% of that, which is what HUD has said is the percentage that should not go over someone paying in their rent, then you get $15,720. We divide that by 12, the months of the year, and you get around $1,310. So these units for one household person should not cost over $1,310. And we use that same number to extrapolate up to 3 people, and that number is $1,683. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea.
Yeah, and I did, in our discussions earlier, the 30% of not expending more than 30% of their income on housing made it all clear to me. I was just wondering if we could add that somewhere in the ordinance, just so if someone either in future council or someone else is picking up this ordinance, that they understand the affordability and how we make sure that it's affordable. Because it was a little confusing to me, but that once we talked about the 30%, it cleared it up for me.
Okay.
And I do appreciate again that the opportunity to speak with you and Mr. Trivett, and we try to iron this out. I know we've taken our time with it, but as we've spoken in the past, the Flats and Willow Creek have been good examples of hotel conversions. They were done independently, and now we're looking at the possibility, not the reality, but the possibility of 13 units converting at one time. I think us taking this slow and all council members having the opportunity to have input and speak with you and understand it clearly is going to mean a lot, not only to the city, but to those seeking affordable housing and the owners that are going to invest if they so desire to convert. So again, I know it's been like a slow process, but I think it's been good that we've reached a point where I think we're all pretty comfortable with how it's laid out now.
I think the dialogue has been beneficial, and you've come up with an ordinance that everybody agrees on. So it's good.
Thank you.
I agree with the previous comments, and that was also my concern about, because we talked about it at the last meeting, there was no rent control. There was nothing in the ordinance that would control the rent. And if that's added in terms of that 30% of the AGI, then we would have that, correct? So,
He wants to add the affordability explanation, an explanation of how we define affordability.
and that would be the requirement.
Okay.
If we put it in the ordinance, because it's not in there, it's not in the proposed draft. But in the example you just gave about the $52,000 for a single person in terms of the cap, and that gets to $1,310 a month for rent. This is a question. We're not looking at the person's actual income below the 52,000, right? In other words, if we're saying this, the affordability, regardless of how much that one person's making up to 52,000, the rent could be up to 1310, right?
They just couldn't make over 52,400.
But I'm saying, if they're making less than that, we're not recalculating the maximum
No.
rent.
No.
So this is sort of like a ceiling for their income, a ceiling for what the maximum developer could charge for the rent. And then there'd be the,
Yes, that's correct.
right. And then we're still asking for the report in terms of the measure of affordability, right, on an annual basis.
Yes, the report would still be required.
And so what if the report shows that they're overcharging? What's the recourse?
This is a part of the zoning ordinance, and so there is regulations of violations of the zoning ordinance, and I would lean on Ms. Shelton to explain that further.
It would be a zoning violation. So we would enforce that the way that we enforce any other zoning violation. Typically, a notice of violation is sent. If the owner doesn't bring the property into compliance, then we would file a suit either in the general district court or the circuit court.
And so part of the bringing it into compliance could be the landlord having to refund to the tenant,
And
right?
reduce the amount he or she charges for rent.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griffin, for bringing forth these changes. I agree that I think we're just about there, and I echo Vice Mayor Dent's comments about pleased that we've taken our time. This is a big step for the city and an important tool for helping to address housing affordability, so we do want to be sure and get it right. And for me, I'm comfortable with the number of units being increased to 250. I had a hard time during our first two sessions trying to wrap my head around it, and when I put together a little spreadsheet showing some possibilities with 3 properties, which I think is where we're still going to be, 3 additional properties, it showed some possibilities of mixes that could take us over the 200, which had been suggested before. So I'm okay there, and I agree with the others that I think the 75% of studio units and then 1 and 2 bedroom mix for the other 25% is my preference. And then that allows the developer to, see what best suits the market for those other 25. So, thank you.
And I echo everything that's been said. So first, let me say, Ms. Griffin, thank you very much for the time that you and your office has spent on this. This is our 3rd month in a row I've seen it, but you had a couple months before that on the Planning Commission, and I recognize it's an iterative process. So having been on the Affordable Housing Work Group, it's nice to see it back in front of us and on the docket for Thursday. 2 points here. I agree with the number of 250 for a total of 400. I brought that up. I think that was helped a lot by Councilwoman Ramsey coming up with a spreadsheet showing that a mix of tenancy types can lead us to surpass that 200 cap, and really the idea of 50 units additional doesn't necessarily mean we might hit all 250, but just we don't want to hamstring council in a year from now, 2 years from now when we're reaching that cap. So okay with that. And then similarly, I don't want to block a developer who's finding it economically too difficult to meet the restrictions around 10% of this plus 15 of this. So I think having a 75% allowance for studio apartments is also where I'm leaning. And I'm glad that we'll have an annual process to at least check in on the affordability piece of the units given the developer, that is, their yearly report to council. So very excited for us to be adding on to what has been a successful product for the city in Willow Creek and in the Flats. And again, thank you for all the work you've put in.
Welcome. Thank you.
One more.
Mr.
So
Basil?
one more clarification. So I think we're all leaning towards the 75% portion, but when you actually write the text and we say a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units, is that suggesting that there needs to be at least 1 2-bedroom unit?
Well, it's saying that there should be, you're going to have 75% of the units are going to be studio, and then you're going to have 1 and 2 bedroom units, yes. And they're going to decide and bring us their mix of either 1 or 2.
So
And
to be
two.
clear, for them to meet this wording, if they had just one two-bedroom, that would meet the wording. But because it's a special use permit, we still have the final say.
Right.
Well, that's the way I read it. We have the flexibility to just, whatever mix that the developer is presenting, we have
Right.
the authority to determine whether that's meeting the need that we have currently.
That's correct.
So they really need to sort of look at what the council's going to be accepting in terms of that mix.
It may be different it's going to be different for each facility.
And it could be different for each council, too. So, okay, thanks.
Okay, so if you can just clarify what Pat's amendment to this is, he wants some,
He wants to add a definition of affordability.
It
That
has
is
a
my
definition of
understanding.
affordability. You'd like that definition to be expanded to include 80% of the median income, which is what it says right now, and then not to exceed 30% of that 80% area median income.
So the clarification, really, all it does is clarify how the rent will be calculated. Right now, it says the applicant has to offer an affordable rent based on 80%. And so the question is, how will we define affordable compared to that 80%? Because that's a pretty decent range. So it was an excellent suggestion to clarify that we're going to target the 30%, which is the cost burden category for housing.
And also consistent with the feds, how they calculate rent
Right.
affordability.
so this is a calculation of rent, not a calculus of someone's income.
That's right.
Okay, so, sounds like there's consensus. Is there a motion?
No, I think
sorry,
we'll
Thursday.
just
Thursday,
do it
you're
on
right.
Thursday.
I was so excited, I jumped to Thursday.
So I think the expectation on our part is that on Thursday, the ordinance will be clarified, I think, for the 75% of units to be
Yes.
studio, and then also to include the 30% affordability.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Dameron, Miss Griffin. I was looking at
Welcome.
Ms. Dameron when I said this. Still just so excited about the finances. I wanted to get back to that conversation.
Smiling so much.
At this
All right.
point, Tevya would probably take Ms. Dameron as a planner.
I would.
Good, okay. So we'll move on in the agenda to council communications. Does any member of council have anything they'd like to contribute? No. Thank you. You all have in your packet the scheduled meetings for the rest of December. Most notably, December 8th coming up, just so that everybody's aware, and the city council will have its meeting at 2 o'clock, but thereafter at 5:30 begins the State of the City, where we hope that the citizens and neighbors will come and participate. It'll be here at the Stryker Building, and if crowds get so big and push out these doors, well, there's some room next door, and then if it's even larger than that, we'll have some space over at the community building where folks can watch, and, have a beverage and some hors d'oeuvres, but it should be a fun event. In addition, we're going to be giving out our first annual Mace Bearers Award, which is kind of I call it almost like a key to the city, so that'll be happening on December 8th as well. So tell your friends and neighbors, and look forward to seeing everyone there. So that's the agenda. Takes us now to open forum. If anybody'd like to come forward? Seeing none, close the open forum and go to, I believe we have an item for closed session.
We do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions, and one property matter per subparagraph 3 regarding disposition of a commercial property of which discussion in an open meeting will adversely affect bargaining position or negotiating strategy of a public body.
Second?
Mr. Trivett.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Go into closed session. Thank you.